The envelope feels fragile between my fingers, cream-colored paper that costs more than I should have spent, but something about this needs to feel real, needs to have weight. I stand on the corner of 5th and Madison at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, watching the last diners leave Carmine's through its heavy glass doors, women in silk and men in suits that probably cost what I make in 3 months at the bookstore. I should feel foolish. I do feel foolish. But my therapist said to write down what I cannot say, and I have been writing for 3 weeks now, filling page after page with words that no one will ever read, and it feels like screaming into a void that swallows sound. The decorative mailbox stands beside the restaurant entrance, ornate black metal with gold filigree, probably some upscale marketing gimmick for comment cards or reservation requests. And I have been watching it for 5 nights, working up courage for this small act of release. Marcus left 47 days ago. I am not counting anymore, except I am, always counting, always marking time by his absence, by the hollow he carved out when he said I was too much and not enough simultaneously, too needy and too distant, a contradiction he could not solve, so he stopped trying. The letter in my hand says nothing about Marcus. It talks about longing, about the ache of being unseen, about wondering if somewhere in this massive, indifferent city there exists someone who could read my thoughts and not turn away. Ridiculous, pathetic, therapeutic. I step forward before I can reconsider, my boots clicking on cold pavement, breath forming clouds in November air that bites exposed skin. The slot opens easily and I slide the envelope through, hear it whisper down into darkness. My heart pounds stupidly, as if I have done something dangerous instead of discarding paper into what is probably a trash bin checked once weekly by underpaid staff. But it feels like release, like setting something free. I turn away quickly, pulling my second-hand coat tighter, already composing tomorrow's letter in my mind. Because this is the thing about wounds. They keep bleeding until you let them, until you stop pretending you are fine, and admit to the empty air that you are lonely and frightened and wondering if anyone will ever truly see you. The restaurant glows behind me, warm light spilling onto sidewalk, the kind of place I will never enter, where people live lives I will never touch. I do not look back. I walk toward the subway that will carry me to my studio apartment with its radiator that clanks and its view of brick wall, and I feel lighter somehow, emptied of words that have been choking me. Tomorrow I will write another letter, and another, screaming into the void until maybe the void answers back. Dante Caruso finds the letter at 1 a.m., when he walks the perimeter of Carmine's, as he does every night, checking locks and sight lines, ensuring his flagship property remains secure, because in his world, nothing stays protected unless you guard it yourself. The cream envelope catches his eye, wedged in the decorative mailbox his manager installed 6 months ago for customer feedback, something he approved without interest, another detail in an empire built on countless details. He extracts it carefully, notes the quality of the paper, the careful handwriting that loops and curves with old-fashioned precision, and something makes him open it rather than toss it with the bills and reservation requests. The words hit him like a fist to the sternum. She writes about loneliness, about moving through crowds and feeling invisible, about wondering if connection is real or just a story people tell themselves to endure the isolation of existence. No name, no address. Just raw honesty that feels obscene in its vulnerability, like watching someone bleed and being unable to look away. He stands under the streetlight reading it twice, 3 times, while his driver waits at the curb and the November wind cuts through his $1,000 suit. He should throw it away. He folds it carefully and slips it into his inner pocket, feeling the paper rest against his chest as he slides into the back seat. That night in his penthouse overlooking the city, surrounded by space and silence and steel, he reads the letter again, studying each line for clues about who wrote these words, who dared to confess such things to no one and everyone simultaneously. It has been 16 years since anything surprised him. He keeps the letter. The second one arrives the next night, waiting in the same mailbox when he checks at midnight. This one talks about fear, about building walls so high that nothing gets in, but nothing gets out either, about slow suffocation of safety. His hands are steady as he opens it, but his pulse is not. By the fourth letter, he has arranged his schedule to ensure he personally checks the mailbox each night, waving off his confused security team, offering no explanation because he has no explanation that makes sense. By the seventh letter, he realizes he is waiting for them, anticipating them, needing them in a way that feels dangerous and unfamiliar. She writes about desire, about wanting to be known, about the difference between being looked at and being seen. His world is blood and money, power maintained through fear and absolute control, negotiations conducted with fists and bullets, respect earned through ruthless calculation. He has not felt softness in so long he forgot it existed. Her letters remind him of something he thought he killed years ago, some part of himself he buried because weakness gets you destroyed. He begins keeping them in his desk drawer, locked away like the contracts and ledgers and photographs of enemies. When Marco, his lieutenant, asks why he seems distracted, Dante does not answer. When blood needs spilling and territories need defending, he handles it with his usual cold efficiency, then returns home to read her words, feeling the contrast like acid. Letter 11 arrives on my cream paper, but the words have changed, grown bolder, more reckless, because something happened between letter 7 and now. A shift inside me where the act of confession stopped being therapy and became necessity, became hunger. I write about desire now, not abstract longing, but specific physical ache, the want to be touched with intention, to have someone's hands learn the geography of my skin like a language they are desperate to speak. I write about fantasies, about surrender, about the terrifying beauty of being completely known by another person. Standing at the mailbox at 11 p.m. has become ritual, the single bright point in days that blur together in shelving books and ringing up sales and avoiding my phone where my mother's twice-monthly guilt trips wait in voicemail. I slide letter 11 through the slot, and for just a moment I let myself imagine someone reads these words. Someone who understands them. Someone who wants the person who writes them. Foolish hope. Sweet poison. I turn to walk away and notice the black sedan parked across the street, engine running, interior dark. My pulse jumps, but I tell myself this is New York. Cars everywhere, meaning nothing. Still, I walk faster toward the subway, glancing back once to see the sedan has not moved. Paranoia, I decide. Too many hours alone with my thoughts. What I do not know is that inside the sedan, 2 of Dante's men watch me disappear into the crowd. One of them lifting a phone to report that the subject has made her drop, timeline consistent, still no clear facial identification. What I do not know is that Dante has been waiting in his penthouse office, ignoring the meeting with his accountants, watching his phone for confirmation that tonight's letter has arrived so he can leave immediately to retrieve it. What I do not know is that his obsession has become obvious to his inner circle, that Marco has started asking dangerous questions about why the boss suddenly cares about restaurant mail, that this distraction is creating gaps in attention that enemies notice. Dante dismisses the accountants mid-sentence and drives himself to Carmine's, unwilling to wait for his driver, needing to hold the envelope she held minutes ago. He extracts letter 11 and reads it standing under the streetlight, her words about desire and touch igniting something fierce and possessive in his chest. He wants to find her immediately, to tell her he sees her, but he forces discipline, returns to his car, and drives north where his phone is buzzing with the call he has been avoiding. Santoro family, rivals who have been testing his borders for 6 weeks, pushing into his territory in Brooklyn, undercutting his protection rates, disrespecting the agreements that keep the peace. Marco's voice is tight with controlled anger when Dante finally answers. They hit the warehouse on Prospect, burned 400,000 in merchandise, sent 2 of our guys to the hospital. This is a declaration, boss. We need to respond tonight or we look weak. Dante's hand tightens on the steering wheel, Emma's letter resting on the passenger seat. Her words about kindness and human connection still echoing in his mind while Marco lists targets and body counts. He tastes the familiar bitterness of his reality, the violence that solves all problems in his world, the blood that buys respect. My apartment is a fourth-floor walk-up in Queens, where the radiator clangs all night and the neighbor's television bleeds through walls thin as paper, where I live surrounded by books I have read 3 times each, because new ones cost money, I allocate to electricity and groceries, where the window looks onto a brick wall 8 feet away, and sometimes I stand there wondering if this is all my life will ever be, small and contained and lonely. I earn $1,950 a month at Meridian Books on the Lower East Side, a cramped shop that smells like old paper and the dreams of its owner who believes physical books will outlast the digital apocalypse. And most days I agree with him. Most days I find comfort in the weight and texture of pages, in the way stories let me live other lives, because my own feels like waiting, endless waiting for something to begin. My mother calls every 2 weeks from Phoenix, where she moved 6 years ago with husband number 3, calls to tell me about her yoga classes and her book club and her remodeled kitchen, asking about my life in the tone people use when they expect nothing interesting, and I give her nothing interesting because we ran out of real things to say to each other when I was 14, and she chose her boyfriend over my stability, moving us 4 times in 3 years before I aged out of her responsibility and into my own survival. I do not tell her about the letters, about how I started writing them 3 weeks after Daniel left, after he said I was too intense, too needy, too much feeling, and not enough fun, after I realized I had poured myself into another person who found me overwhelming rather than precious. The writing started as purging, as bloodletting, as a way to evacuate the loneliness that was poisoning me from inside. But it became something else, became the most honest communication I have ever created, because there is freedom in knowing no one will answer, no one will judge, no one will find me too much. I write letter 14 on a Tuesday night after a shift where I sold 6 books total and spent 7 hours alone with my thoughts. Write about invisibility, about moving through the world unnoticed, about wondering if I matter to anyone, if my absence would create even a ripple in the fabric of anyone's day. I write about wanting to be seen, really seen, not looked at but understood, known in the deep places I keep hidden, because exposure has only ever brought pain. I seal the envelope and walk the 40 minutes to Carmine's, because the subway feels too crowded tonight, and I need the cold air to clear my head, need the movement to quiet the anxiety that hums constant in my chest. I drop the letter in the mailbox at 10:47 p.m. And for just a moment, I let myself imagine kind eyes reading these words. Someone who does not find my intensity repellent but compelling. Someone who wants all of me instead of edited versions. Foolish fantasy, but it keeps me breathing. What I do not know is that those kind eyes exist, that Dante Caruso reads my letter at midnight in his penthouse, reads about invisibility and longing while looking out at a city he controls but cannot connect with, reads my words and feels them like recognition, like coming home. Marco arrives at the penthouse at 9 a.m. with surveillance footage cued on his tablet, his expression carefully neutral in the way that means he has found something significant, and Dante gestures him into the office, where morning light cuts sharp angles across the marble floor, where he has been awake since 4 a.m., rereading letter 14 for the 5th time, her words about invisibility, carved into his memory like scripture. We have positive identification, Marco says, turning the tablet to show grainy footage from 3 nights ago, a camera angle Dante insisted they install across from Carmine's, and there she is, walking into frame at 10:47 p.m., a woman in a dark coat with her hair pulled back, unremarkable to anyone not searching, but Dante's breath catches because even in black and white pixels, he can see something in the way she moves, something careful and self-contained, something that speaks of a person who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Marco taps the screen and the footage zooms, enhances, shows her face for 4 seconds as she lifts her head before dropping the envelope into the mailbox. And Dante memorizes every detail, the delicate bone structure, the sad eyes, the mouth that looks like it has forgotten how to smile. And he feels the same vertigo he felt reading her first letter. Recognition of something essential, something he did not know he was missing until it appeared. Her name is Emma Sinclair, Marco continues, pulling up a second file with background information that Dante both needs and hates needing. Invasion of privacy that feels wrong even as he devours every detail. 28 years old, works at Meridian Books on Ludlow Street, lives alone in Queens, no criminal record, no significant assets, no close relationships that surveillance has identified. Ordinary, Marco says, and the word lands like judgment, like dismissal, and Dante feels anger flash hot in his chest because she is not ordinary. She is the person who writes about longing and desire and hope with a rawness that breaks him open every single night. I want eyes on her building and her workplace, Dante says, but at a distance, no contact, no approach, nothing that makes her feel unsafe. Marco's expression shifts into concern, the kind that comes from 10 years of service and hard-won permission to speak truth. Boss, this is a distraction we cannot afford right now. Not with the Santoro situation escalating, not with Brooklyn needing your full attention. Dante knows this, knows his obsession is dangerous, knows that in his world any weakness becomes a target, but he cannot stop, cannot walk away from the only thing that has felt real in years. Just do it, he says in the voice that ends discussions, and Marco nods and leaves, and Dante is alone with the frozen image of Emma on the tablet screen, her face caught in the moment before she released her letter into his world. That night he drives to Carmine's himself and parks across the street at 10:30 p.m., engine off, watching the mailbox like a sentry, and at 10:51 she appears, walking from the south with her hands in her pockets and her breath fogging in the February cold, and seeing her in person, in movement, in 3 dimensions, hits him with unexpected force. She is smaller than he imagined, more fragile, and the sadness he detected in the footage is even more pronounced in the slope of her shoulders, the way she approaches the mailbox like it is both confession and burden. She slides the envelope through the slot and stands there for a long moment with her hand pressed against the metal. And Dante wonders what she is thinking, what words she has written tonight, whether she still believes no one reads them, or whether some part of her hopes. She turns and walks away, and he sits frozen, every instinct screaming to follow, to introduce himself, to tell her he sees her. But he forces stillness because approaching now would shatter whatever fragile thing exists between them, would make him real, and therefore dangerous, would end the honesty of her letters. He waits until she disappears around the corner, before retrieving letter 17, opens it in his car under the dome light, and her words tonight are about fear, about the terror of never being loved, of dying alone and unmissed, of wasting her one life waiting for someone who will never arrive. And something shifts in Dante's chest, something cracks and reforms, because he realizes with absolute clarity that he is falling in love with a woman who does not know his name, falling in love with her wounded honesty, and her desperate hope, and her beautiful broken way of seeing the world. And this realization is more dangerous than any rival family, any bullet, any betrayal he has survived, because Emma Sinclair has become the single point of light in his darkness, and he will burn his entire world down before he lets that light go out. The call comes at 2:17 a.m. when Dante is reading Emma's letter from earlier that evening, her words about finding beauty in small kindnesses still warm in his mind. And Marco's voice cuts through the quiet with 3 words that ignite cold fury in his blood. They hit the warehouse, and Dante is moving before conscious thought, instinct and training taking over, grabbing the gun from his desk drawer and the jacket that conceals it, his mind already calculating response and consequence and the necessary violence that his world demands when boundaries are crossed. The warehouse in Red Hook is burning when he arrives 23 minutes later, flames eating through the roof and painting the night orange, and two of his men are dead on the concrete with bullet wounds that speak of execution rather than firefight, and the Santoro family has left their signature, a calling card of disrespect that cannot go unanswered without appearing weak, without inviting further encroachment, and Dante feels the familiar cold settle over him, the shutdown of feeling that allows him to do what must be done. He spends the next 4 hours in a kind of controlled rage, gathering his captains, planning retaliation, making the calls that will result in blood and broken bones, and the message that his territory is not available for taking. And at 6:30 a.m., he is in a basement in Canarsie, watching Luca Santoro's nephew beg for mercy that Dante cannot afford to give, watching his own hands deliver violence with mechanical precision, and some distant part of him observes this brutality with disgust, with weariness, with the knowledge that this is who he is and who he will always be. He returns to the penthouse at 8:15 with blood on his cuffs and the smell of smoke in his hair and a weight in his chest that feels like drowning, strips in the bathroom and stands under water hot enough to burn, scrubbing his hands until they are raw, trying to wash away the stain that he knows goes deeper than skin, lives in his bones, marks his soul. It is 9:40 when he finally sits at his desk in clean clothes with wet hair and hands that still feel contaminated, and he sees the envelope there waiting, letter 18, retrieved from Carmine's by Marco during the night's chaos, and for a long moment Dante stares at it, afraid to open it, afraid that her words will show him too clearly the gulf between her world and his, between her gentle hope and his necessary violence. But he cannot stop himself, breaks the seal with fingers that tremble slightly, unfolds pages covered in her careful handwriting. And she has written about hope tonight, about believing in human goodness, despite evidence to the contrary, about kindness as a radical act, about choosing compassion even when the world encourages hardness, and the contrast between her words and his actions from the past 7 hours breaks something open in his chest, something that feels like grief or longing or the terrible recognition that he is falling in love with a woman whose values indict everything he is, whose innocence highlights his corruption, whose light makes his darkness more visible and more unbearable. And he sits there with her letter in his blood-stained hands, understanding with perfect clarity that Emma Sinclair represents everything good he has forfeited, everything pure. His choices have made impossible, and he wants her anyway, wants her desperately, wants her with a hunger that terrifies him because it feels like the only true thing in his false and violent world. And this wanting, he knows, will destroy them both. Emma notices on a Tuesday afternoon when she walks past Carmine's on her way home from the bookstore, glancing at the ornate mailbox out of habit, seeing it empty the way it always is after she deposits her letters. But this time, something registers differently. A awareness that prickles at the back of her mind. Because she has been leaving letters for 18 days now, and not once has she seen any of them still sitting in the box during daylight hours. And this observation, once made, refuses to be ignored. She lies awake that night staring at her ceiling with her heart doing strange, complicated things in her chest, wondering if someone is reading her words, if a person she will never meet knows her secrets and her longings and her most vulnerable confessions, and the thought should horrify her, should send her running from this ritual she has built. But instead, she feels something else, something that tastes like exposure and thrill mixed together. The terrifying, exhilarating possibility that she is not invisible after all, that someone somewhere sees her even if she cannot see them. The next letter she writes is different, bolder, and her hands shake as she fills 3 pages with words she would never say aloud, about desire and need and the specific loneliness of lying in an empty bed, imagining phantom touch, about wanting to be wanted with an intensity that frightens her, about dreams she has started having of faceless hands and whispered promises. And when she seals the envelope, she almost cannot bring herself to deliver it, stands in her apartment for 20 minutes, holding it like evidence of a crime, before finally grabbing her coat and walking to Carmine's through the March cold and sliding it into the mailbox with her pulse hammering in her throat. Dante finds letter 21 at 11:30 p.m. and reads it in his car with the engine running and his hands gripping the pages hard enough to wrinkle them. And her words tonight are so raw, so unguarded, so full of aching human want that he has to close his eyes against the surge of feeling that threatens to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. And he wants to go to her immediately, wants to tell her that she is seen and desired, and absolutely not invisible, that he reads every word she writes like scripture, that her loneliness calls to his loneliness across the dark city. But he forces himself to drive home instead, forces himself to add this letter to the locked drawer in his office where he keeps all the others, 20 letters now arranged in chronological order, his most valuable possessions, and he runs his fingers over the stack with something approaching reverence. Marco finds him there at 1:15 a.m., standing at the open drawer like a man at prayer, and his expression shifts into concern that edges toward alarm. "Boss, we need to talk about this," and Dante knows what is coming, knows his obsession has become visible and therefore dangerous. But he does not close the drawer, does not hide the evidence of his weakness. "You are distracted," Marco says carefully, "and distraction in our business gets people killed. The Santoro situation is not finished despite last week's message, and you are spending your nights reading love letters from a woman who does not know you exist. This cannot continue." Dante hears the logic, recognizes the truth, knows that Emma has become a liability he cannot afford. But when he looks at Marco, his voice is cold and absolute. The letters continue. The surveillance continues. Nothing changes. And Marco's face tightens with frustration and worry. But he nods because orders are orders, even when they lead toward destruction, even when they compromise everything, even when they reveal that Dante Caruso has finally found the one thing more powerful than his legendary control, and that thing is a lonely bookstore clerk who writes her heart onto paper and leaves it in a mailbox for ghosts. Dante walks into the bookstore at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, with his heart doing something unfamiliar in his chest, something that might be nervousness if he were a man who allowed himself such weakness. And the bell above the door chimes soft and musical as he enters the cramped space that smells of old paper and dust and something floral he cannot identify. Emma is shelving books in the poetry section with her back to him, wearing jeans and a gray sweater that slips off one shoulder, her dark hair twisted into a messy knot. And Dante stops just inside the doorway, watching her reach for a high shelf, watching the curve of her neck and the unconscious grace of her movements. And he knows 47 things about this woman from surveillance reports and 23 more from her letters, but seeing her here in her element, breathing the same air, steals something from his lungs. She turns at the sound of the bell finally, her eyes finding him across the narrow aisle, and he watches awareness move through her face, the polite smile of customer service shifting into something more alert, more uncertain, because even civilian women have instincts about dangerous men, and Dante has never been anything but dangerous. "Can I help you find something?" she asks, and her voice is exactly as he imagined from her written words, soft but clear, a little hesitant, and he moves toward her with careful, deliberate steps, keeping space between them, keeping his body language open and unthreatening in ways he has studied. "I am looking for a recommendation," he says, and the lie tastes strange on his tongue because he has not read a book for pleasure in 15 years, has not had time for anything but survival and strategy and the endless calculations of power. "What kind of books do you usually enjoy?" Emma asks, stepping down from her footstool, and he notices she is smaller than he expected, the top of her head reaching barely to his shoulder, and there is a smudge of dust on her cheek, and he fights the urge to brush it away. "Something real," Dante hears himself say, something with truth in it, and her eyes sharpen with interest, the first genuine engagement breaking through her professional distance. She studies him for a long moment, and he wonders what she sees, wonders if his expensive suit and his careful grooming hide the violence underneath, or if she can sense the blood on his hands, despite the 3 days since the Santoro retaliation. Fiction or non-fiction, she asks, moving toward a different shelf, and he follows at a respectful distance, watches her fingers trail across spines with the reverence of someone who loves these objects. Fiction, he says, because he wants to know what stories she values, what narratives she finds meaningful. Emma pulls 5 books from various shelves, stacking them in her arms like children, and she talks about each one with an animation that transforms her face, makes her beautiful in a way the surveillance photos never captured. And Dante listens to her words about love and loss and redemption, and feels each title like an arrow finding marks he did not know were vulnerable. "I will take all of them," he says when she finishes, and surprise flickers across her features. "All 5, she asks, and he nods, follows her to the register, watches her ring up the sale with fingers that tremble slightly, and he wonders if she feels it too. This strange electricity in the air between them, this recognition that has no logical source. Emma writes letter 24 that night with her hands still trembling from the memory of his voice, the way he looked at her across the bookstore counter with eyes so dark and intense she felt stripped down to her bones. And she fills 4 pages describing the stranger who came into her store, a man whose name she does not know, but whose presence lingered in the air long after the door chimed his exit. And she writes about the expensive cut of his suit and the way he moved like violence contained in elegant packaging, and the strange contradiction of his hands, brutal and scarred but holding her books with unexpected gentleness. She describes the electrical charge she felt when he stood close enough for her to catch his scent, something dark and cedar and entirely male, describes the way her heart hammered when their fingers brushed during the transaction, describes lying awake afterward replaying every word of their brief conversation and wondering if she imagined the weight of his attention, the focus he gave her, like she was the only person in the world worth seeing. She seals the letter at 1:30 a.m. and delivers it at 6:15 a.m. on her way to open the store, and Dante finds it at 10:22 a.m. between meetings about territory disputes and revenue projections, and he reads her words in his car with Marco waiting patiently in the driver's seat. And when he reaches the part where she describes him, describes feeling seen by a stranger in ways the people who know her never manage, something breaks open in his chest. "She felt it too," he says aloud, and Marco glances at him in the rearview mirror. With expression caught between concern and resignation, "Boss, you need to step back from this before it becomes a problem we cannot contain." But Dante is already texting his assistant to clear his afternoon schedule, already planning his return to the bookstore, already addicted to the feedback loop of her words about him generating his presence, generating more of her words. He arrives at 2:15 p.m., and she looks up from the register with surprise that shifts into something warmer, something that looks almost like pleasure, and his pulse does something irregular and entirely unprecedented. "You came back," she says, and there is a question in her voice, a tentative hope that makes him want to promise her things he has no business promising. "I finished 2 of the books already," he lies smoothly, "wanted to discuss them with you if you have time," and her face lights with genuine delight that strikes him like a physical blow. She props the door open with a doorstop and flips the sign to back in 15 minutes, and they sit in the cramped back office on mismatched chairs with books stacked in towers around them, and she talks about themes and characters and emotional truth with her hands moving through the air like conducting music, and Dante watches her more than he listens, memorizing the curve of her mouth and the way she tucks hair behind her ear, and the vulnerability in her eyes when she asks what he thought of the ending. He gives answers he constructs from book reviews he read last night in preparation for this exact conversation, and she leans forward engaged and animated, and he realizes with something close to terror that he would burn his entire empire down just to keep her looking at him like this, like he matters, like he is more than the sum of his violence. Marco spots the tail first on Tuesday morning during his routine sweep of the surveillance perimeter. A black sedan with two occupants parked 3 blocks from the bookstore with sightlines on the entrance, and he runs the plates through their police contacts within 20 minutes, and the vehicle comes back registered to a shell company tied to the Vittorio family, and Marco feels cold certainty settle in his gut as he calls Dante with news that will shatter whatever fragile happiness his boss has been building. "We have a problem," Marco says without preamble when Dante answers. The Vittorios know about the girl, and there is silence on the line for 5 seconds that feel like 5 hours, before Dante speaks in a voice gone flat and deadly. "How long have they been watching?" "Since yesterday at least," Marco replies. "Maybe longer if they were careful. They have photos, boss. I saw the telephoto lens." And Dante disconnects without another word, and Marco knows his boss is already moving through the calculations of damage control and threat assessment and the inevitable violence that comes when enemies identify weakness. Dante sits in his office with his hands pressed flat against the mahogany desk to keep them from shaking with rage at himself, at his carelessness, at the way he allowed his obsession with Emma to blind him to basic operational security, and he sees with terrible clarity the chain of mistakes that led here. The repeated visits to her bookstore, the surveillance teams he posted that created patterns the Vittorios could notice and backtrack. The way he let himself believe he could have something pure and good without it being contaminated by the blood and violence that defines his existence. He pulls up the security feeds from his own cameras positioned around Emma's neighborhood and rewinds through 48 hours of footage until he finds them, the watchers in their unremarkable car, and he sees the timestamp shows they picked her up 2 days ago, which means they know where she lives, where she works, her routines and vulnerabilities, and the knowledge that he painted a target on her back makes him want to put his fist through the wall. His phone buzzes with incoming text from Marco, containing 3 photos taken with long lens: Emma leaving her apartment, Emma walking to the bookstore, Emma standing at the decorative mailbox depositing her morning letter, and Dante stares at that final image, understanding that the Vittorios now know about the letters too. Know about the thing that connected him to her before they ever spoke, and the invasion of that privacy feels like desecration of something sacred. He has 2 choices, and both of them are agony. He can disappear from her life immediately, cease all contact, and hope the Vittorios lose interest in a target that no longer provides leverage, condemn her to confusion and abandonment, but keep her safe through his absence. Or he can stay close, assign protection details, bring her into his world enough to make her understand the danger, and accept that his presence in her life might be the thing that gets her killed. Emma does not write a letter on Wednesday morning, and the absence sits in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold, because she spent Tuesday night lying awake thinking about the stranger with the dangerous eyes, and the way he looked at her in the bookstore, like he could see straight through skin and bone to the secret vulnerable core of her. And somewhere in the sleepless hours, she realized she has been writing love letters to an imaginary recipient while developing feelings for a real man, and the 2 things feel impossibly tangled, like she is betraying one for the other, even though neither knows she exists in the way she wants to exist. She stands at her kitchen counter at 6 a.m. with blank paper and pen, but no words come because what can she write to the unknown reader when her mind is full of the known man? The way his voice sounded like dark honey and smoke, the way his scarred hands held her books with reverence, the way he came back a second time, which means something or means nothing, and she cannot tell which possibility terrifies her more. Thursday morning comes and goes with no letter, and Friday the same, and she feels the loss of her ritual like grief, like she has amputated some essential part of herself, but she cannot find her way back to the honesty those letters required when her heart is confused and conflicted and afraid of wanting something real after so long making do with fantasy. Dante checks the mailbox Wednesday at 10 a.m. and finds it empty, and tells himself she is simply late, checks again at noon and 3 p.m. and 6 p.m., and the emptiness mocks him. And Thursday he sends Marco to verify the mailbox is still functional, that no one has removed it or blocked it, and Marco reports back that everything is intact, which means Emma has stopped writing, and Dante feels panic rise in his throat like bile. He pulls up surveillance footage of her apartment and sees her leave for work at normal time, watches her move through her day at the bookstore, confirms she is physically safe. But the absence of her letters feels like she is disappearing anyway, like he is losing her before he ever really had her. And he realizes with sick clarity that he has become dependent on her words, the way other men become dependent on drugs or alcohol, that she has been his daily fix of something pure in a life built entirely on corruption. Friday afternoon, he makes a decision born of desperation and need, and the terrible fear that his attempt to protect her by staying away has already driven her away permanently, and he texts Marco to find out where Emma takes her lunch breaks, learns she has a favorite coffee shop, 2 blocks from the bookstore. And at 12:30 p.m., he walks through the door of the small cafe, with its mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, and he sees her sitting alone by the window with a sandwich she is not eating and a book she is not reading. She looks up when the door chimes, and her eyes widen when she sees him, and something complicated crosses her face, something that looks like relief and fear in equal measure, and he approaches her table with his heart doing things hearts should not do in men like him. And he asks with careful casualness that costs him everything, "Mind if I join you?" And she hesitates for 3 seconds, that feel like 3 years, before nodding slowly. And he sits across from her in the worn chair and thinks this is either salvation or destruction, and he no longer knows which one he is hoping for. Emma returns to her apartment at 7 p.m. after the coffee shop lunch with Dante, feeling like her skin has been turned inside out, every nerve exposed and raw, because they talked for 90 minutes about books and favorite seasons and childhood dreams, and he listened with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. And she cannot reconcile the warmth spreading through her chest with the fear that she is falling for someone she does not really know. And she drops her keys on the kitchen counter and sees her phone screen glowing with a notification from an unknown number. Her finger hovers over the message for 3 seconds before she opens it, and her entire body goes cold, ice water in her veins, because there on her screen is a photo of herself standing at the decorative mailbox outside the restaurant, her hand reaching toward the slot, the angle and clarity suggesting professional surveillance, and below the image are 11 words that shatter her fragile sense of safety. "Stay away from Dante Caruso or you will regret it." She reads it 4 times, trying to make the words mean something different, her hands shaking so badly the phone nearly slips from her grip, and questions cascade through her mind faster than she can process them. Who took this photo? Who is threatening her? And most terrifying of all, who is Dante Caruso, that someone would warn her away from him with such menace? She sits on her couch in the gathering dark without turning on lights and opens her laptop with trembling fingers, types his name into the search bar, and the results load like a slow-motion car crash, article after article from news sites and crime blogs, and investigative journalism pieces. Alleged organized crime figure. Suspected head of the Caruso family operations. Under investigation for racketeering and extortion. 2 photos accompany the articles, courtroom sketches, and one grainy long-distance shot. And it is unmistakably him, the man who bought books from her, who drank coffee with her today, who looked at her like she mattered. The betrayal hits her like a physical blow, doubling her over with nausea, because he deceived her, approached her under false pretenses, and worse, far worse, he must be the one who has been reading her letters. Her most private thoughts poured out to a stranger she imagined as safe and anonymous. And he has known all along, known who she was and what she wrote while she remained ignorant of his identity and his world. She opens a new document and begins typing through her tears, the words coming sharp and jagged. "I do not know why you read my letters or what you wanted from me, but I know now who you are, and I cannot do this, cannot be part of whatever game you are playing, and this is my last letter, My final words to you. Goodbye to the stranger I thought I knew, and goodbye to the man who lied with his silence. She prints it on the cheap printer that jams twice, folds the paper with shaking hands, and at 9 p.m. she walks the 6 blocks to the mailbox in the dark, with her hood up and fear singing in her blood. And she slides the letter through the slot, knowing it is an ending. And she does not see the black sedan parked across the street or the men inside watching her with predatory patience. Dante retrieves the letter from the mailbox at 10:47 p.m. because he could not wait until morning, his hands uncharacteristically unsteady as he unfolds the paper, and the words hit him like bullets, each sentence a wound. Her goodbye carved in ink that might as well be his own blood. And he is reading it for the third time, standing under the streetlight, when his phone vibrates with an alert from the security system he had Marco installed to monitor the street where Emma lives. Motion detected, multiple vehicles, unauthorized presence, and ice floods his veins because he knows with terrible certainty what this means. He is in his car before conscious thought catches up. Marco in the passenger seat, materializing from the shadows where he is always waiting, and Dante drives with lethal speed through red lights and empty intersections while Marco makes calls that summon more men, and the 15-minute drive takes 7 minutes and it is still too long. Every second an eternity, where she could be hurt or taken or killed because of him, because his world touched hers and contaminated everything pure about her. They arrive to see her building's front door hanging open, the lock shattered, and Dante takes the stairs 3 at a time with his gun already drawn and Marco at his back. And he hears her scream from inside her apartment, high and terrified, the sound of furniture breaking, male voices rough with violence and anticipation, and something ancient and murderous rises in him, something that has always lived in his chest but never felt like this, never felt righteous. He kicks her door open and sees 3 men, 2 holding her against the wall while she fights like a cornered animal, all desperate strength and futile resistance, and the third turning toward the noise with his weapon rising, and Dante fires twice, center mass. The man drops, and he is moving before the body hits the floor. The next 90 seconds are brutal choreography written in blood and bone. Marco taking the man on the left with efficient precision, while Dante closes the distance to the one gripping Emma's arm. And he does not simply shoot this one, he needs to hurt him, needs to make him pay for putting hands on her. And his fist connects with the man's jaw with enough force to shatter teeth, and Emma stumbles backward as the man releases her. And Dante hits him again and again, until Marco's hand on his shoulder pulls him back from the edge of killing with his bare hands. The apartment smells like copper and fear, and Emma is sliding down the wall with her eyes wide and unfocused, shock setting in, and Dante holsters his weapon and moves to her, crouching down, his hands hovering over her shoulders, afraid to touch her, afraid his violence has made him untouchable. But she is looking at him with something that is not quite recognition, and he says softly, "Emma, we have to go. It is not safe here." And she whispers, "You killed them." And he says, "Yes, and he would kill 100 more." She does not resist when he lifts her, does not speak when he carries her down to the car, and Marco drives while Dante holds her in the back seat and feels her shaking against him like a wounded bird. And she turns her face into his chest and says against the fabric of his shirt, soaked with someone else's blood, "You read my letters, and it is not a question," and he answers into her, to hair, every single one, and she makes a sound that might be a sob or might be a laugh, and he holds her tighter as they drive toward the safe house on the north side where no one will find her, where he can keep her alive even if she hates him for it, even if this is where her goodbye becomes permanent and real. The safe house is all glass and steel and cold luxury perched on a hillside where the city spreads below like scattered diamonds, and Emma sits on a leather sofa that probably costs more than her annual rent, while shock slowly releases its grip on her nervous system, her hands still trembling, her breathing still too quick, and Dante stands across the room near the floor-to-ceiling windows with his back to her, and his shoulders rigid with tension, and the silence between them stretches taut and dangerous until she finally speaks, her voice hoarse from screaming. "You read my letters." He turns to face her, and his expression is unreadable, carefully controlled. And he says yes, all of them, and she laughs, a sharp broken sound without humor, and says so. This was what, some kind of game? Some sick entertainment for a man who has everything? And anger is flooding through her now, burning away the fear. And she stands on unsteady legs and says, "Tell me why. Tell me what you wanted from me." He moves closer, but stops when she steps back, maintaining distance. And he says, "I found the first letter 4 months ago. It was in the mailbox outside my restaurant. I own the building, and I read it because I was curious. And then the next day there was another, and I have never in my life read anything so honest, so real, and I kept them. I kept every single one." She shakes her head and wraps her arms around herself and says, "You had no right. Those were private. They were not meant for you." And he says quietly, "I know, and I am sorry, but I am not sorry I read them. I am not sorry I know you." She wants to scream at him, but her throat is tight, and tears are burning behind her eyes, and she says, "You lied to me. You came to my store and pretended to be someone normal, someone safe. And all the while you knew everything about me, and I knew nothing about you except the lies. And do you understand how that feels? How violated? How exposed?" His jaw tightens and he says, "I never lied. I just did not tell you everything." And she laughs again and says that is the same thing, and he says, "No, it is not. I never pretended to feel something I did not feel. Everything between us was real." She thinks of the men in her apartment, the gunshots, the blood spreading across her floor, the efficient, brutal way he broke bones and ended lives to protect her. And she says, "What are you? Who are you really?" And he meets her eyes with an intensity that makes her breath catch and says, "I am the head of the Caruso family. I run operations across 6 states. I do things that would horrify you. I have blood on my hands that will never wash clean. And I also read your letters every night before I sleep because your words are the only beautiful thing in my life, the only pure thing I have ever touched." She sits back down because her legs will not hold her, and she says, "I do not know if I can do this. I do not know what you want from me." And he crouches in front of her, close but not touching, and says, "I want you safe. That is all. You can hate me. You can leave when this is over, but I will keep you alive." Emma wakes on the third morning in the safe house to find Dante already gone. The space where he slept on the sofa in the adjoining room empty, except for a neatly folded blanket. And she has learned his patterns now. How he rises before dawn and makes coffee in the gleaming kitchen and takes calls in Italian that sound like commands. How he leaves her breakfast on the counter with a careful distance that feels like both respect and punishment. And she hates how she listens for his footsteps. How she has memorized the sound of his voice even through closed doors. The safe house is beautiful in a sterile way, all clean lines and expensive furniture that no one really lives in, and she explores it like a museum of his wealth, touching surfaces that are too perfect, staring at abstract art that probably costs more than her life is worth. And in the study she finds his briefcase left open on the desk. Black leather and heavy brass fixtures. And she knows she should not look. But her hands move before her conscience catches up. Inside are files and a laptop, and beneath them a wooden box, cherry wood polished to a soft glow. And when she opens it, her breath stops completely, because inside are her letters, all of them, organized by date with small slips of paper between them, and her hands shake as she lifts the first one and sees his handwriting in the margin, a single word, "beautiful," and the next has a question mark beside a sentence where she wrote about fear, and another has a date and a note, "the day I saw her," and she realizes he has annotated them like scripture, like every word matters, like her rambling thoughts are something precious worth studying. She sits on the floor with the box in her lap and reads his notes, sees herself reflected through his eyes, and her anger begins to crack, because this is not the collection of a predator. This is the archive of someone who has been lonely for so long. He does not know how to be close to another person, except through stolen words. She finds the letter she wrote about wanting someone to see her truly, to know the parts she hides, and his note beside it says, "I see you," and her throat tightens with something that is not quite forgiveness, but is no longer fury. When Dante returns at midday, he finds her still sitting there surrounded by paper, and he stops in the doorway, his expression unreadable, and she looks up at him and says, "You kept them all." And he says, "Yes." And she says, "You wrote on them." And he says, "I wanted to remember how each one made me feel. I wanted to answer you, even though you could not hear me." And she stands slowly and says, "This is crazy. All of this is completely insane." And he nods and says, "I know." And she says, "I should hate you." And he says, "You should." And she says instead, "I think I am starting to understand you." And something shifts in his face, something vulnerable and raw. And he says, "That is more than I deserve." And she says, "Probably," but she does not look away. Night settles over the safe house like a heavy blanket, and Emma cannot sleep, the silence too thick and her thoughts too loud, so she wanders to the living room in borrowed pajamas that are too big for her, and finds Dante standing at the window staring at the city lights, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and exhaustion carved into every line of his posture, and when he hears her footsteps he turns and says, "You should rest," and she says, "I cannot. My mind will not stop." And he nods like he understands and gestures to the sofa, and she sits while he pours her a drink she does not ask for, and they sit in opposite corners with space between them that feels both necessary and impossible. And finally she says, "Why did my letters matter so much to you? Really?" And he is quiet for so long. She thinks he will not answer, but then he speaks and his voice is low and stripped of its usual control. He says, "I grew up in a house where love was currency and violence was language. My father ruled with his fists, and my mother died when I was 7. And after that, there was nothing soft left in my world. I learned to hurt before being hurt, to take before being taken from. And by the time I was 20, I had built an empire on fear and blood, and I was completely alone inside it. And then I found your first letter, and you wrote about wanting to be seen, and I realized I had never been seen in my entire life. I had been feared and obeyed and hated, but never known. And your words were like discovering there was still something human inside me worth knowing." Emma feels her throat tighten, and she says, "I wrote those letters because after my ex left me, I felt invisible, like I was disappearing and no one would notice. And my mother left when I was 15, and I spent my whole childhood trying to be good enough to make her stay, and it was never enough. So I stopped trying to be seen by real people, because the rejection was too painful. And the letters were safe, because no one could reject someone they never met. But you read them, and you kept them. And somehow that is more terrifying than anything else, because now someone knows the parts of me I never show, and I do not know if I can survive being rejected by someone who actually sees me." Dante moves closer, not touching, but near enough that she can feel the heat of him, and he says, "I see you, and I am not going anywhere. I see your fear and your loneliness, and your desperate hope that the world can still be kind. And I see your strength even when you think you are breaking. And you are the most real thing I have ever encountered." And Emma looks at him and sees past the danger and the violence to the lonely boy who grew into a lonely man. And something inside her chest cracks open and she leans forward, and so does he, and their mouths are inches apart, and she can taste the whiskey on his breath and feel the tremor in his hand as he reaches for her face. And then fear floods through her, and she pulls back and says, "I am sorry. I cannot not yet. I am not ready." And the disappointment in his eyes is devastating. But he nods and says, "Whenever you are ready or never, I will still be here." And they sit in the darkness with almost touching hands until dawn breaks over the city. Emma wakes to voices in the hallway, low and urgent, and she recognizes Marco's tone, Dante's most trusted lieutenant, the one who looks at her with undisguised suspicion, and she moves silently to the door and presses her ear against it, and hears Marco say the intelligence just came through. Vitale and both his captains will be at the warehouse tomorrow night. This is the opening we need. And Dante's voice is calm and certain when he says, "Prepare the team. Full tactical. I want this finished cleanly." And Marco says how many. And Dante says everyone who was there when they gave the order to take her. No loose ends. No one left to come back for revenge. And Emma's blood turns to ice because she understands what they are planning. Not a negotiation or a threat, but an execution, multiple executions. And she steps back from the door with her heart hammering and her mind spinning because this is the reality of his world. Not abstract danger, but concrete death delivered by his command. She waits until Marco leaves, and then she opens the door and Dante is still standing in the hallway looking at his phone, and he glances up and sees her face, and knows immediately that she heard. And he says nothing, just waits. And Emma says, "You are going to kill them," not a question, but an accusation. And he says yes, and she says how many people, and he says as many as necessary to end this threat permanently. And she feels sick and furious and terrified all at once, and she says there has to be another way. You could negotiate, or go to the police, or... And he cuts her off with a look that is almost pitying and says, "Emma, this is not your world. We do not call police. We do not negotiate with people who tried to kill you. We eliminate threats or we die. There is no other way." She wants to argue, but the certainty in his voice stops her, and she says, "So, you are just going to become a murderer for me." And his expression hardens, and he says, "I became a murderer long before I met you. This is who I am. This is what I do. And I will not apologize for protecting you the only way I know how." And she says, "But you have a choice. Everyone has a choice." And he steps closer, and his eyes are dark and uncompromising. And he says, "My choice is you alive or them alive. I choose you every time. And if that makes me a monster, then I am a monster, and you need to decide right now if you can accept that, because tomorrow night I am going into that warehouse and I am ending this. And when I come back, I will have blood on my hands again, and you will know exactly what I am capable of. And if you cannot live with that, then tell me now." Emma stares at him and sees no regret in his face. No hesitation, only a cold resolve that terrifies her because it is so absolute. And she thinks of the letters he kept, the tenderness he showed her, the loneliness in his eyes when he spoke of his childhood. And she cannot reconcile that man with the one standing before her planning death with such casual certainty. And she says, "I do not know if I can watch you become this." And he nods slowly and says, "Then maybe you should not watch. Maybe you should decide if you want me to arrange protection somewhere far from here, where you never have to see what I do to keep you safe." And the ultimatum hangs between them like a blade. Dante leaves at dusk without looking back, and Emma watches from the window as 3 black vehicles pull away from the safe house, carrying him toward violence she cannot stop and does not fully understand. And the guards he leaves behind are polite, but distant, positioned at doors and monitors. And she feels like a prisoner in this beautiful space filled with leather and steel and silence. She tries to read, but the words blur together. She tries to watch television, but every sound makes her jump, and the hours stretch impossibly long as night deepens and her imagination conjures 1,000 terrible scenarios. Dante bleeding out on concrete, Dante with cold eyes pulling a trigger, Dante becoming something she cannot love, and she paces the length of the living room until one of the guards quietly suggests she try to rest, and she wants to scream at him that rest is impossible when the man she is terrified to admit she loves is out there doing monstrous things to keep her safe. She returns to the bedroom and sits on the bed and stares at her hands and realizes with sudden crushing clarity that she has already made her choice, that she made it the moment she did not ask him to send her away, that somewhere between the fear and the fury and the impossible tenderness she has fallen completely in love with a man who lives in darkness. And the truth of it terrifies her more than any threat, because loving him means accepting all of him, the violence and the gentleness, the monster and the man. And she does not know if she is strong enough, but she knows she cannot walk away. She finds paper in the desk drawer, expensive stationery that probably costs more than her weekly salary, and she begins to write the way she used to write to no one. But this time she writes to him. She writes, I do not know when it happened, but somewhere between your secrets and your honesty, I fell in love with you. And I am terrified because I do not know how to love someone who lives the way you do, but I also do not know how to stop, and I keep thinking about what you said about choosing me, and I realize I am choosing you too. I am choosing you even though it scares me, even though I do not understand your world, even though I know you will do terrible things and come home with blood on your hands. I choose you because underneath everything, you are the loneliest person I have ever met, and you saw me when I was invisible, and you kept my words like they mattered, and maybe that is enough to build something on. Maybe love is just choosing someone every day, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard, and I need you to come home because I need to tell you this, to your face. She folds the letter and places it on the pillow beside her, and lies down fully clothed because she cannot bear to be vulnerable in sleep, and she must drift off, despite her intentions, because she wakes to the sound of the front door and heavy footsteps, and she bolts upright with her heart in her throat, and runs to the hallway, and sees him, Dante, alive, standing in the entryway with blood on his shirt, and exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and their eyes meet across the distance, and he says it is over. And she does not ask about the blood or the bodies, or what he did. She just closes the space between them and reaches for his face and says, You came back. Dante stands in the hallway looking down at her with eyes that hold exhaustion and something else, something raw and unguarded, and he lifts one blood-stained hand to cover hers where it rests against his jaw, and he says, You should be asleep. And Emma says, I could not sleep until you came home. And the admission hangs between them, weighted with everything she has not yet said, and he studies her face with an intensity that makes her breath catch, and he says, I need to shower. I need to wash this off before. And she nods and releases him, and watches him disappear into the bathroom, and hears the water start. And she returns to the bedroom, and sits on the edge of the bed and stares at the letter on the pillow, and wonders if she has the courage to let him read it, or if she should hide it away and pretend she never wrote those words. She is still deciding when he emerges 20 minutes later, wearing clean clothes with his dark hair damp and his face drawn with a fatigue that goes deeper than physical tiredness, and his eyes go immediately to the folded paper on the pillow, and he says, What is that? And Emma's heart hammers against her ribs, and she says something I wrote while you were gone, and he moves closer and picks up the letter and looks at her with a question in his eyes, and she nods permission, even though terror floods through her, and she watches his face as he unfolds the paper and begins to read, watches his expression shift from cautious curiosity to something that looks like pain and wonder combined. And when he finishes, he does not look up immediately, just stands there, holding her words in hands that she knows took lives tonight, and the silence stretches so long she thinks she might shatter from the tension. Finally, he raises his eyes to hers, and she sees they are bright with unshed tears, and he says, You cannot love me. His voice rough and broken, and she says, But I do. And he shakes his head and says, Emma, you do not understand what I did tonight, the things I am capable of. You cannot love someone like me. And she stands and closes the distance between them and says, I am not asking for your permission. I am telling you what is already true. And he says, I am giving you a choice right now. I will put you somewhere safe with enough money to start over. You will never have to see me again. You will never have to live in fear or compromise who you are. I will guarantee your safety, and you can walk away and forget this ever happened. The offer lands like a blow, and Emma feels tears burn her eyes, and she says, Is that what you want? For me to leave? And his jaw tightens and he says, What I want does not matter. What matters is giving you the choice I took away when I pulled you into my world. And she says, You did not pull me anywhere. I chose to write those letters. I chose to fall for you, and I am choosing to stay. And his control fractures and he says, You do not know what you are choosing. And she takes the letter from his hands and says, Then show me. Help me understand. Let me stay long enough to see your world clearly and decide with open eyes. But do not send me away because you think you are protecting me from yourself. And something in his expression cracks wide open, and he pulls her against him with desperate urgency and buries his face in her hair, and she feels his whole body shaking. Dante holds her through the trembling until his breathing steadies, and then he pulls back just enough to look at her face, and he says, I will show you everything. But you have to promise me something. Promise me that when you have seen it all, you will tell me the truth about whether you can live with it. And Emma nods and says, I promise. And he says, I mean it. Emma, I do not want you to stay because you feel trapped or obligated, or because you think you can change me. I need you to see who I am and what I do, and decide if that is something you can accept. And she says, I understand, and something in her steady gaze must convince him, because he releases her and runs a hand through his damp hair and says, we start tomorrow, get some sleep. And she wants to argue that she could not possibly sleep now, but exhaustion crashes over her like a wave, and she realizes the adrenaline that has sustained her is gone. And he must see it in her face, because he guides her back to the bedroom and says, I will be in the next room if you need anything. And she catches his wrist and says, stay, just until I fall asleep. And he hesitates only a moment before nodding and sitting in the chair near the window while she climbs into bed. And she falls asleep watching his silhouette against the glass and wondering what tomorrow will bring. Morning arrives with pale light and the smell of coffee, and Emma wakes alone. But she finds Dante in the kitchen already dressed in a dark suit that probably costs more than her monthly rent, and he hands her a cup and says, drink this. We have a long day ahead, and 30 minutes later, she is in one of the black vehicles riding through the city to destinations unknown, while Dante makes calls in Italian, and she watches the streets blur past and tries not to let fear overwhelm her curiosity. Their first stop is a warehouse in an industrial area, and Emma tenses when she sees the guards. But Dante takes her hand and says, these men work for me. You are safe here. And he leads her inside where she sees rows of shelving and workers moving boxes, and everything looks almost legitimate until she notices the way everyone defers to Dante with a respect that borders on fear, and she realizes this is the infrastructure of his empire, the mundane machinery that supports the violence. He shows her the security systems and the inventory logs, and explains that this facility handles imports, and half of what moves through here is legal and taxed, and the other half is not. And he does not apologize or justify, just states facts and watches her face for judgment. And Emma asks what is in the illegal shipments, and he says mostly liquor and cigarettes, some pharmaceuticals, nothing that will get anyone killed. And she nods slowly, and he says, I have rules, Emma. No drugs that destroy lives, no human trafficking, no harm to civilians who are not in the game. I know that does not make me good, but it means I have lines I will not cross. Their next stop is a restaurant in Little Italy, where an older woman embraces Dante and kisses both his cheeks and calls him Il mio ragazzo, and introduces Emma as La Bella Ragazza, and serves them pasta that tastes like heaven. And Emma learns that Dante owns this place too, and that the woman's grandson got into trouble with a loan shark 3 years ago, and Dante made the debt disappear. And she sees the genuine affection in the woman's eyes and realizes that protection means something different here. That Dante is not just feared, but valued by people who depend on him. They spend the rest of the day visiting more locations and meeting more people, and with each stop, Emma sees new layers of the world Dante inhabits. A world of loyalty and violence and codes she is only beginning to understand, and by the time they return to the penthouse as the sun sets, she feels overwhelmed by information and emotion and the weight of the choice she is making. Dante pours them both whiskey, and they stand at the windows overlooking the city lights, and he says, You have seen enough for today. Tomorrow I will show you more if you still want to know. And Emma turns to look at him in profile against the darkening sky, and she realizes that somewhere during this impossible day, her fear has transformed into something else entirely, something that makes her pulse race and her skin feel too tight, and she says, "Dante." And he turns to face her, and whatever he sees in her expression makes his eyes darken and his body go very still. She closes the distance between them in 3 steps and rises on her toes and kisses him before courage can fail her. Kisses him with all the confusion and desire and desperate need that has been building since the moment he carried her out of her apartment. And for one terrible second, he does not respond, and she thinks she has made a catastrophic mistake. But then his control shatters, and he is kissing her back with a hunger that steals her breath, one hand fisting in her hair, and the other gripping her waist and pulling her against him, and the glass tumbler falls from her hand to the floor unnoticed. The kiss is nothing like the gentle, almost kiss in the safe house. This is raw and demanding and edged with something almost violent. And Emma feels heat flood through her body and pooling low in her belly, and she makes a sound against his mouth that is part surrender, part plea, and Dante tears his lips from hers and says, "Emma, we should not. You are not thinking clearly." And she says, "I am thinking more clearly than I ever have. I want this. I want you." And he searches her face with an intensity that feels like it could burn her alive, and he says, "If we do this, there is no going back. I will not be able to let you go." And she says, "Then do not let me go." And the last thread of his restraint snaps, and he lifts her, and she wraps her legs around his waist, and he carries her to the bedroom. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knows this is reckless and possibly self-destructive. But her body has made a choice. Her mind is still catching up to. He lays her on the bed with surprising gentleness given the urgency thrumming between them, and he pauses and says, "Last chance to stop this." And Emma reaches up and pulls him down to her and says, "I do not want to stop." And then there are no more words, just hands and mouths and the desperate removal of clothing. And when he finally moves over her, she sees something raw and unguarded in his eyes, something that looks like worship and desperation combined. And she pulls him closer and whispers his name and feels him tremble against her. The joining is both fierce and tender, pleasure edged with an intimacy that terrifies her with its intensity. And when she falls apart in his arms, she feels tears leak from the corners of her eyes, because this is more than physical. This is the final wall crumbling, and Dante kisses the tears away and follows her over the edge with her name on his lips, like a prayer or a confession. Emma wakes wrapped in Dante's arms, with morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and for a moment she feels nothing but peace, his breath warm against her neck and his body solid and safe around hers. But then reality crashes back and she remembers everything she has chosen and the danger that comes with it and the fragility of this happiness they have built on a foundation of violence and desperation. She turns carefully in his embrace to find him already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it makes her chest ache. And he says good morning, in that low voice that sends shivers down her spine, and she says good morning back, and kisses him softly, meaning it to be gentle, but it deepens quickly into something heated until his phone buzzes harshly on the nightstand and shatters the moment. Dante goes very still, and then reaches for the phone with the hand not holding Emma. And she sees his expression change as he reads the screen, all the softness draining away and being replaced by something cold and lethal. And he says, "Get dressed now." And the command in his voice makes her stiffen, but she also hears the fear underneath it, and that terrifies her more than anything. She scrambles out of bed, grabbing clothes while Dante makes rapid calls in Italian, his voice clipped and furious. And when he ends the third call, he turns to her and says, "Marco Rossi's lieutenant survived the takedown 2 weeks ago. He has been in hiding, and my sources say he is coming for you, for revenge." And Emma feels ice flood her veins, and she says, "How does he even know about me?" And Dante's jaw tightens and he says, "Because I have been careless, because I have been so focused on you that I missed the signs, because I let my guard down." Within 10 minutes, the penthouse is swarming with Dante's men, hard-faced soldiers who move with lethal efficiency, checking exits and setting up security perimeters. And Dante tells her to pack a bag, because they are moving her to a secure location immediately. and something in Emma snaps at the way he issues orders without consulting her, as though she is a piece of property to be relocated. She says no, and the room goes silent, and every man turns to look at her. And Dante stares at her like she has lost her mind and says, "What did you say?" And Emma lifts her chin and says, "I said no. I am not running and hiding again. I am tired of being the helpless victim everyone has to protect." And Dante crosses to her in 3 long strides and grips her shoulders and says, "Emma, this is not a discussion. There is a professional killer who wants you dead to hurt me, and I will not take chances with your life." And she says, "Then, do not take chances, but also do not lock me away like I am something breakable. I want to help. I want to be part of finding this threat and ending it." Dante's hands tighten on her shoulders, and she sees fury and fear warring in his eyes, and he says, "You do not understand what you are asking. This is not your world. You are not trained for this." And Emma says, "Then train me. Show me, include me. Because if I am going to be with you, I need to be your partner, not your possession." And the words hang in the air between them like a challenge, and she sees the moment he recognizes that this is about more than just immediate danger. This is about the entire foundation of what they are building together. Dante stares at Emma for a long moment, and she sees the battle playing out behind his eyes, the instinct to protect her warring with the recognition that she is right. And finally he releases her shoulders and turns away and runs a hand through his hair and says, "Fine. You want to help? Then help. Tell me what you know about tracking someone who does not want to be found." And Emma feels a flash of frustration because he is testing her, challenging her to prove she has anything to offer. But she also understands that this is how he survives in his world, by trusting only competence and results. She says, "I know how to research. I know how to find patterns in information. I spent 4 years in college learning how to analyze texts and contexts, and people are not so different from stories. They leave traces and clues whether they mean to or not." And Dante turns back to her with something that might be respect flickering in his expression, and he says, "All right, come with me." He leads her to a room she has never entered before, a study lined with monitors and filing cabinets, and a large table covered with photographs and documents. And 3 of his men are already there, including Luca, who looks at Emma with undisguised surprise when she walks in beside Dante, and Dante says, "Emma is going to help us find Rossi's lieutenant. Give her everything we have." And she sees the glances exchanged between the men, the skepticism and concern, but no one argues with Dante's order. For the next 2 hours, Emma immerses herself in the information, police reports and surveillance photos and intercepted communications and financial records. And at first it is overwhelming, a glimpse into the machinery of violence and counter-violence that keeps Dante's world turning, but she forces herself to focus, looking for the patterns she promised, and slowly something begins to emerge. She notices that the lieutenant, a man named Vito Greco, has been using a series of burner phones, but the calls always originate from locations within a 5-block radius in the old industrial district. And she points this out to Luca, who pulls up a map and marks the locations and says she is right. There is a pattern. He must have a base in that area. And Dante leans over her shoulder to look at the map, and she feels the heat of his body and the tension radiating from him, and he says, "Good work. That narrows our search considerably," and the praise in his voice sends a warm rush through her chest. They spend another hour planning, identifying the most likely buildings where Vito might be hiding, and Dante is assembling a team to sweep the area when Emma notices something else. A detail in one of the surveillance photos that shows a restaurant in the background with a distinctive red awning, and she says, "I know that place. I used to go there when I was in college. It closed down 3 years ago, but the owner still lives in the apartment above it." And Dante goes very still and says, "How do you know that?" And Emma says, "Because I interviewed him for a project about small businesses. He told me he would never sell because his wife died there, and it was all he had left of her." And Dante looks at the map and the building Emma identified is right in the center of the search radius. And he says, If I wanted to hide somewhere, no one would think to look. I would choose an abandoned building with a grief-stricken old man who never leaves and never asks questions. Dante mobilizes his team within 15 minutes, and Emma watches the transformation as the men move with coordinated precision, checking weapons and reviewing building schematics. And she feels both awed and terrified by this glimpse into the machinery of violence that operates in the shadows of the city she thought she knew. Dante tries one more time to convince her to stay behind, but she holds firm and says, "If my information leads you there, then I need to see this through." And finally he agrees, but only if she stays in the vehicle with 2 guards until the building is secured. And she accepts this compromise, understanding that she has proven her value, but not her ability to survive a firefight. The drive to the old industrial district takes 20 minutes through streets that grow progressively more desolate, past shuttered factories and graffitied warehouses. And Emma sits beside Dante in the back of the armored SUV, watching his face as he reviews the plan with Luca over the radio. And she sees no hesitation in him, no doubt, only cold focus and lethal intent. They park 2 blocks from the target building, and Dante turns to her and cups her face in both hands and says, "If anything goes wrong, if you hear gunfire that does not stop, Antonio will drive you straight to the secondary safe house and you will wait there until I come for you. Do you understand?" And Emma nods and says, "Please be careful. Please come back to me." And he kisses her hard and desperate, and then he is gone, moving into the darkness with 8 of his men like shadows with purpose. Emma watches through the tinted windows as they approach the restaurant with the red awning, and her heart hammers so hard she thinks it might break through her ribs. And Antonio sits in the driver's seat with his hand on his weapon, and his eyes scanning constantly, and the minutes stretch like hours. Then she hears it, the sharp crack of gunfire, 3 shots, then silence, then a burst of automatic fire that makes her flinch, and Antonio starts the engine and says, "We need to go now." But Emma says, "Wait. Just wait, please." And she sees movement near the building entrance, and more shots. And then figures emerging, and she cannot tell if they are Dante's men or enemies, until Luca's voice crackles over the radio saying, "Target neutralized, building secure, one of ours wounded but stable." Emma sags with relief, so profound she feels dizzy, and Antonio relaxes slightly and says, "Your man is lucky to have someone who cares whether he comes home. Most of us do not have that anymore." And Emma looks at this hard-faced soldier and sees the loneliness underneath and says, "Maybe you will find it someday." And he gives her a small, sad smile and says, "Maybe." Dante returns 10 minutes later with blood on his jacket that she prays is not his, and he slides into the vehicle and pulls her against him and says, "It is done. Vito Greco will never threaten you again." And Emma does not ask what done means, does not ask about the blood or the body. She just holds him and feels grateful and guilty and in love all at once. 3 months pass, and Emma moves through her days with a lightness she never imagined possible, splitting her time between the bookstore she refused to give up and Dante's penthouse that has become home in ways that have nothing to do with the marble floors or the breathtaking view of the city at night. She keeps writing letters, but now she leaves them on his pillow, or tucked into his jacket pocket, or folded beside his coffee cup in the morning. Small, intimate missives that say, "I see you and I choose you and I love you" in 100 different ways. And he reads every single one aloud to her in that low, rough voice that still makes her pulse quicken, turning her words into something sacred between them. The danger has not disappeared because danger never disappears entirely from his world. But Emma has learned to live with it the way she has learned to live with his 2 a.m. phone calls and the weapon he keeps in the bedside drawer, and the way his men look at her now with respect instead of skepticism, because she proved herself not fragile, but fierce when it mattered. She reopened the bookstore 6 weeks ago, and Dante bought the building so no landlord could ever threaten her sanctuary, and she told him that was too much. But he said nothing is too much for your happiness, and she believes him because she sees the truth in his eyes every time he looks at her, like she is the only real thing in his world of shadows and compromises. Tonight he comes home earlier than expected and finds her curled in the leather chair by the window writing another letter, and he kisses the top of her head and says, "I have something to show you," and there is nervous energy in him that she has never seen before. He takes her hand and leads her to a part of the penthouse she has never entered, a reinforced door that requires both a key and a code. And when it opens, she sees a climate-controlled room lined with archival boxes, each one labeled with dates, and her breath catches because she understands immediately what this is. Dante says every letter you ever wrote, every word you left in that mailbox before you knew I existed, I kept them all. I built this vault to preserve them because they saved me before I ever met you. They reminded me I was still human underneath everything else. Emma walks along the rows of boxes and sees months of her loneliness and longing preserved like museum pieces, physical proof that her words mattered, that she mattered, and tears blur her vision as she turns to him and says, "You kept them all, every single one." And he says, "I will keep every letter you ever write for the rest of our lives, because you gave me something I thought I would never have. You gave me hope and truth and love without conditions." She kisses him then, pouring everything she feels into the press of her mouth against his. And when they finally break apart, she says, "I need to write one more." And he hands her the pen he keeps in his pocket and a piece of paper, and she writes in the vault, surrounded by the evidence of their strange beginning. This is not the ending, but the beginning. This is not the last letter, but the first of forever. This is me choosing you every day for all the days we have left. He reads it aloud as he always does, and his voice breaks on the final words, and Emma knows that whatever comes next, they will face it together. Two lonely people who found each other through words in a mailbox and built something real from ink and danger and improbable love.